of that, actually. So we are continuing our way through chapter 7 here. This chapter, we were just talking before we started. This is kind of a rough place to start a Monday, but it's where we are. This whole chapter is really Paul communicating with the church in Corinth about marriage and marital issues, not marriage in the sense of instruction on how to be married, but really on like whether to be married. And Paul here, this is often pointed to, this chapter is sometimes pointed to as an example that Paul doesn't have a real high view of marriage. I'm not sure that's fair, though you can definitely get there from here. And it won't be today, it'll probably be tomorrow or maybe even Wednesday, but I will point out why I think it's a little bit unfair, but you certainly can see how they get there as we go through the next couple days. So from verse 8, here's where we start. To the unmarried and the widows, I say it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they're not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than be flamed with passion. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord, the wife should not separate from her husband. If she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And that the husband should not divorce his wife. We can stop there. We'll go quickly. So we saw this a little bit Thursday. Paul is saying here, marriage is sort of a concession, and he says it here. If you're not married, if you're in an unmarried position, you should stay that way if possible. But if that is difficult, if that is going to lead you to wrong choices, then you should get married. And so marriage really comes across here as kind of an accommodation to sinfulness. And again, I understand that. Be a little patient before you jump to that conclusion, because there are some things coming later in the chapter that nuance it a little. But you can certainly see that this is not Paul ringing the marriage bell very strongly here.
Yeah, and let's give some context here. Paul spends his entire life on the move, and we get the sense elsewhere that Paul is intending to recommend that the church remains nimble. The idea that the church that you can move and you could proclaim the gospel, you could be an evangelist yourself. The idea, let's not get over encumbered. Jesus is coming back. There's a kind of real practical ethic involved here. And you also have to frame this, that there's this real sense here that Paul is trying to get people to live the most radical version of the faith that they are able to do, right? And so this whole point that if you're not practicing self-control, then by all means marry. Put yourself in a social order that will be comfortable, that you'll be able to sustain. But there is this sense that we get here that Paul does kind of think of this like some choices, and he does give some merit to one choice over another, which, I'm not sure that we're incredibly comfortable with that sort of stratification. But I do think it is interesting, this idea that there are some life choices that a Christian could make that may help us in one way over another. I mean, that sense alone is an interesting thing to have a conversation about.
Tomorrow we'll hear Paul say this explicitly, but we begin to see it already. There is a sense that Paul is making for constancy here. In other words, stability. So not to make big life changes in the aftermath of coming to the faith. And so if you're married, stay married. If you're not married, stay unmarried. He's going to expand on that tomorrow. But there is a sense in which he's saying that those things demand our earthly attention. And as such, they can be a distraction. And so don't let them do that to us, but rather channel our energy into our faith. So then he says to the married, basically, stay married. Don't separate. If you do separate, come back together. This is pretty much historic teaching. We've seen this various places in the New Testament. The New Testament has a strong, as does the Old Testament, a strong bias against separation, against divorce. Now, we add to that a note of grace and understanding in the modern church. However, as a general rule, honoring and committing to stay married, if at all possible, is the bias of the New Testament. I don't think there'd be any way around that, really. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just going to, that's a reflection of our covenantal understanding of that relationship.
Yeah. So here, verse 12, to the rest I say, I and not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who's an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. This is a very interesting insight into the early church and into the kind of disruption that coming to faith in Jesus Christ could cause within a household. We have other references of this causing division in families, in father-son or child-parent relationships. But here we get a look at what happens, and one assumes that this must be the case in this community. These are probably not theoretical words. These probably address a real situation. And what is very interesting is that we've seen Paul in verse 10 say, I give you a commandment. Well, not I, but the Lord. And here he says, to the others I say, I am not the Lord. So again, Paul sometimes gets pegged with the idea of being full of himself. I think this is very interesting that he's saying, look, I can't tell you what God thinks about this. I'm not giving you instructions from God, but here's what I think. And that is, if you come to the faith and your spouse will stay with you, then do that, because you can live together and perhaps even have an impact on them. Perhaps as you live out the faith in front of them, you may even bring them themselves into the faith with you. And so don't let there be separation if there doesn't need to be. However, if they can't take it and they want to leave, then you should let them go, because God calls you to peace. It's a very interesting dynamic here. I think a fascinating look into some of the complications that the faith was causing in the first century.
Yeah, we're dealing with the specific topic of marriage, but you were right to point us to, I think, Clint, the idea of general disruption. We have largely, everyone joining this conversation, have largely lived in a time and culture where being Christian does not by definition create social consequences. Now, it may in some families. I realize not everyone has had the same sort of road to the faith, but in the ancient world, we forget that persecution lurked, because the church was in so many ways a threat to the social order of the day. We forget that some of the earliest Christians dealt with the reality, if I convert to the faith, I will no longer be welcome in my profession, because my profession ascribes deification. Thank you. Powers to the idol of the trade, and so the idea of choosing Christ is the ultimate choosing not to follow this way of life, choosing not to live even within your family's lineage, the trade that has been handed down. And so I take this as another example of that. Essentially, Paul's saying, hey, listen, to whatever extent possible, let's not disrupt. Let's not cause people to be kicked out of families if we don't have to. Paul clearly has theological boundaries. He clearly says there are some things where we must be people of the faith, and we must stand that line. But in these really very practical matters, Paul seems to want to really thread that needle and to try to get as close as possible so that the church isn't known as rabble-rousers. The church really can live as integrated in a society as possible. Paul seems to believe that there's real value in Christians being stable, Christians being people of character, people being embedded where they live, And this seems to me just another example of that Christians shouldn't be known as the ones who get rid of marriages, and unless that's absolutely necessary. Christians should be known as people who are good, generous, faithful, even when they're in an unequally yoked marriage.
Yeah, and I think if we narrow in on a couple of verses here, we get maybe a new insight to the depth that Paul actually views marriage. Just a few verses ago, it was looking like Paul doesn't think that much of marriage at all. But look at verse 13 here, verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is made holy, the word there is sanctified, through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her husband. And so notice that he has said of these people simultaneously that they are unbelieving, but that they are sanctified because of their connection with a believer. So strong is Paul's understanding of marriage that what one spouse does has an implication on the spiritual status of the other, that they stand before God not as two separates, but as one partnership, as one thing. And if one of them believes, that literally has a bearing on the status of the other one, which is a fascinating idea. One in the American church we've largely downplayed as we've kind of come to the idea of evangelical and each person has to make their own decision. This sort of covenantal understanding is probably not normal in most modern churches, but it is very interesting that Paul sees in marriage a depth of connection so deep that it goes to the extent of changing the unbelieving status of a person to sanctified because of the spouse. That is really interesting.
Yeah, reel me back in here, Clint, if you feel like I'm taking this too far. I do think you could make a really interesting argument from a Reformed perspective that Paul is pointing to the fact that our Christian witness has implications for secular structures, for secular social realities. So that if Christians are living faithfully as Christians, then the grace that gets worked within us, and therefore the works that flow out of us, will naturally have in his words, salvific kind of effect in our deepest relationships. And there's this kind of outrageous faith in that God could work within us a kind of transformation as individuals that could actually seep through us into those lives of the people closest to us, even if those people are unrepentant, even if those people don't for themselves call upon Jesus Christ. The idea that the love of Christ could in some way flow out of us in a way that was still effective, to whatever extent we would come to understand that term, what Paul really means using this word to save here. But there is this sense in which what Christ does in us does not end in us. We do overemphasize the individual sometimes and miss the really practical and substantial implication that if God does something in us, it will by definition have impacts upon those in the circles that surround us. I mean, that is the true and ultimate form of witness. And from a Reformed perspective, I do think there's something really interesting in that profession of faith.
Yeah. And I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but though Paul says some things that don't sound real high on marriage earlier, it does seem that he's taking very seriously, concretely seriously, the things we heard him say earlier, that a husband and wife belong to one another, that they are united as one. And here it is fascinating that Paul seems to believe that the husband and wife do not stand individually before God, but that as one is connected in Christ, it has implications for the other as well, both in the sanctification, and in verse 16, in the example, in the actual transmitting of the faith. So it may transmit sanctification, and it may transmit transmit faith. And for Paul, this is the beautiful possibility that is remaining connected for a husband and wife. And I don't want to, I mean, maybe I'm defending Paul, but when you understand this properly, I think it shows an incredibly deep and nuanced understanding of what it means that men and women are connected in marriage. And that can easily get lost in some of the less kindly things he has said about it earlier. But I want to suggest that there's a balance here, and I think we'll see more of that throughout this chapter.
Yeah, very briefly, remember where we started this section where we were talking about the man who needed to be thrown out. He was having inappropriate relations with his mother-in-law. Think about how vast the ground has been that we've covered here. Paul writes to the Corinthians and says, this man in particular, and you as a community in general, have misunderstood what I was talking about when I talked about freedom from the law, right? And then he goes so far as to this point in time as to say, I take the binding, this covenantal language so seriously that I don't think you should even leave it if one is a believer and the other isn't. And in some ways, that is a shocking journey to take to the Corinthians. If they have believed that all human relationships have been dissolved because of the gospel, what Paul's arguing here is, quite frankly, unbelievable. It is just so opposite what appears to maybe have been the operative wisdom within the Corinthian church, which, if that's true, if I'm reading that correctly, it's no wonder this letter was received with a heavy heart. I mean, these would be tough words to process if that's how far apart they are.
Yeah. And we'll continue to have some of these things. I think tomorrow will be an interesting twist on where we've been so far, and I think it will give some insight into part of what Paul is thinking and part of what motivates him in this discussion.
Friends, thanks for being with us. Have a blessed afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.